In this video, we're going to start styling some of our inputs. So we have some text-based inputs like this one, we have our select dropdown, and we're not going to focus on stuff that comes from third-party libraries like the date picker. We're going to leave the default styles there. We're going to style these two as well as the inputs over here. Once again, two more text and a text area. Now there are a few different ways we can get this done. We can just use generic element selectors to select, for example, all inputs and give them some styles. But there is a problem. When we introduce third-party components like the date picker, they also use inputs. And if we start messing around with a lot of generic selectors, we might be breaking the styles for that component. So if we actually crack open the DevTools, we can take a quick peek at this. I'm going to use the selector, which does come with the keyboard shortcut. I'm going to pick the input right here, and you can see that internally inside of the HTML from the React Dates library, they are using a text-based input. It comes with its own set of styles, which is why it's looking like it looks. If we go ahead and use a generic selector, we're also going to be adding styles to this, which is actually not something we want. We don't want to touch the styles for that at all. That means all we need to do is set up some classes and apply those classes to our inputs in order to get the styles showing up. Let's go ahead and start this process by creating a new file over in the components directory. This is where we can contain the selectors for all of our inputs. And I'm going to call this one underscore inputs.scss. And before we go any further, I am going to load it in from styles.scss. I can duplicate the last line and swap out input group for inputs. Excellent. And now we can actually add some new selectors. So for the text input, for example, we could do something like this. I could target all HTML elements with a tag of input, but that's also going to target things in those third-party libraries, which I probably don't want to style. So instead, I'm going to use something like a class .text input. Now I can apply some styles here. I can add that to all of the inputs that should use those styles, and I don't have to worry about messing with the built-in styles for third-party modules. So right here, for example, we could go ahead and add some styles. I'm going to start things off by setting up a border for our input. The input does already have a border. I'm just going to set it up to match the border from React Dates. So border 1 pixel solid, and we'll be using the hex code right here. That is CACCCD. Perfect. And there are a few more styles we'll be defining as well. We're going to set height equal to 50 pixels. Then we're going to go ahead and set the padding. And I'm going to set the padding on all sides to the S size variable. Just a little bit of padding. And we're also going to be setting up font size and font weight. So right here, we'll start off with font size. I'm going to use the variable we created before. That would be font size large, and I'm also going to set font weight, and I'm just going to stick with 300, a nice thin font. So we have these styles in place. We can actually save the inputs partial, and we can start applying this class where needed. For example, right here, I can add on a class name. I can go ahead and provide it. Text-input. Then when we save things and the page reloads, we should see those styles taking effect. Right here, we did see a change, but maybe not the one we expected. Clearly something is off. So to explore this, I'm going to open up the developer tools once again, and I'm going to use the selector to pick the new input. Now, when we are viewing the Elements panel, we have access to our styles, and there's also this computed panel on the right. If your developer tool window is very narrow, it might show up as a separate tab you have to switch over to. Either way, that panel shows some interesting stuff. Up above, we can see exactly what is making up the height and the width for this thing. We have our margin, border, padding, and the actual content. And down below, we can see the final value for all sorts of CSS properties. Now, what I want to explore is this right here. So we set the height equal to 50 pixels, but if I hover over this input, we can see over on the left-hand side, the width is 214, which is fine, but the height is 76. It's not 50. So by default, when the browser is calculating the height of something, or the width for that matter, it takes the height that you specified, it then adds on the padding, and it adds on the border. So we're getting 76 because we have 50 from our height definition. We have 24 from the 12 pixel padding on the top and on the bottom. That brings us to 74, and we have the final 2 from the border, 1 pixel on the top, 1 pixel on the bottom. Now this is the default behavior, but it's almost never what you want. If I say, hey, make this input 50 pixels tall, I want the input to be 50 pixels tall with the border and the padding accounted for. We can get this done, and we do that by setting up something, a universal selector. So I'm going to switch over to the base file, and this is something I do in every single project I work on. I set up the universal selector. Right here, I set box sizing. Now by default, box sizing is set to content box. So if we set it equal to content box, no change. This is already the value. This is where it calculates the height of the content. Then it adds on the padding and the border to get the final height. We're going to set it equal to border box, which is the other option we have. This does exactly what we described earlier. It is going to set the height of the input to 50 pixels. It is then going to remove the space it needs for the border and the padding, and the rest of the space will be given to the content. So if we go ahead and save base.scss, now we see that our input is indeed 50 pixels tall, right on the money. 214 pixels wide, that's fine. 50 tall, that is great. So we have this in place, and that helps us because now if we have things left to right, the height matches up perfectly. We're going to do the exact same thing for the selector right here. I'm going to switch over to the inputs file. Down below, I'm going to set up .select, something we can apply to our select dropdowns, and we're just going to add a few styles. Now the select dropdown is going to share many of the same styles as the text input up above. Now we can share these styles using a few different approaches. First up, we could add a comma on here to select something else, like .select. That would select these, apply the styles, and select these and apply the styles. This would work, but there is an SCSS feature we can use to get the job done as well. We can head over to Sass-lang.com to explore this feature. Remember, this is where the documentation for Sass lives. If we go over to Learn Sass and we go down to Inheritance, we can see an example of this. So we have a selector for the message class, and we add a few styles. Down below, we have the success message. All we really want to do is take everything from message and change the border color to green. So we use the @extend feature followed by the class right here. We can use that exact same tool inside of our file, @extend. What am I going to extend? I'm going to extend text input up above, that is .text-input, and then at the end I just toss a semicolon. So this is going to give me everything from up above inside of my new selector. Now we can go ahead and add more styles on if we needed to. So I could go ahead and set something else up like background red if that's what this particular thing called for, but it's also perfectly valid to just have this in place. Now we have this new class, select. Let's go ahead and actually use it over inside of the filters component. Down below, I'm going to add on class name. I'm going to set it equal to select. Now we can go ahead and save the component file and actually test things out over inside of the browser. Over here, we have the select dropdown showing up. It has all of the styles in place, which is a great next step. Now we have the input and we have the select. Before we continue on to the add expense page, what I would like to do is just add a placeholder right here, similar to the placeholder over here for when there is no text, something like search expenses. I'm going to add that for the input, placeholder, search expenses. Excellent. That's just going to make sure the user knows what to do with this field. They know that it actually does do something meaningful as opposed to just being an empty input. Now we already have some styles in place and we're going to focus on just reusing them for the inputs over here. We can reuse them for these two guys and we're going to add some new ones for this one. Over inside of the component file for expense form, we just need to add some classes onto a few of these inputs. We're going to be adding other styles to this page later on. For now, the big focus is just on the inputs. So right here, class name. We're going to set this one equal to. Over inside of the inputs partial, we'll be using text input for this. And then we can just take this line and copy it down below for amount. Now that takes care of the first three. It takes care of description, amount, and created at, because created at is just a date picker, and we're not going to be adding any custom styles for that. The last one is text area. Obviously, yes, they're still stacked left to right. There's no space. Sure, all of those are problems we're going to solve, but let's just wrap this one up by targeting that text area and styling it. Once again, dot text area Inside of here, we are also going to extend using @extend followed by the class.text input. There we go. Now, not only are we going to extend text input, we're going to add something new on here. So for the select dropdown, we didn't need to override any styles. For text area, we are. We're going to set a new value for height. So we have the old height of 50, which gets set up above by this line. We're going to set the new height for the text area equal to something much bigger to actually give us some room to write in. So I am going to set it equal to 10 rem. Now we can save the inputs partial, and over inside of expense form, we just need to use this class down below. I can add this on, class name. I can set it equal to text area. I can save the actual component file, and over here we should see a styled version of that text area. Once again, yes, everything around it looks just terrible, but the actual input itself looks great, and it is still working as expected. So with this in place, we've made some pretty great progress on the filters area, and we do have the inputs also styled on other pages, even if the surrounding components aren't exactly perfect. Now that we have this in place, we are going to stop for this one, and we're going to continue on in the next one, wrapping up the add expense page and the edit expense page, which are basically the exact same thing. We're going to be reusing things like our page header, so let's go ahead and jump right over there.